And without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Rena Quinland, Wilder Landscapes Advisor for Sussex Wildlife Trust. We're ever so pleased that she's come here today to talk to us. So over to Rena. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So yeah, thank you for having me today. As Diana just introduced, I'm the Wilder Landscapes Advisor for Sussex Wildlife Trust. And I'll be talking a bit more about what I do in that role and our work across Sussex. I actually just started in that role about a month and a half ago, so I'm relatively new. But I have been working in rewilding for about 5 years now, and my other hat that I wear is I work for the Knepp Rewilding Estate, and I'm a wildlife guide there, and I also manage the Exmoor pony herds. And that I give some advice, and I do research in rewilding as well. So I advise on large herbivore reintroduction across the UK. But yeah, 4 days of my week, at least I would say, I work for Sussex Wildlife Trust, and my role is really just to work on improving Sussex to make it as wilder as we can. And that's working with lots of different landowners and different projects. Just start off there. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen all right. That's actually Old Lodge, which is one of our nature reserves in Sussex. And the Wildlife Trust, we just simply believe that nature is just too important to lose. So we're actually celebrating our 60th year this year of celebrating 60 years of conservation. And what I think we're at this point now is actually to say the next 60 years are no longer just going to be conservation, it's going to be wildlife recovery. So we're working across Sussex and working with landowners and different organisations to really try and make it as wild as possible, and also working with people as well. So where are we at the moment? I'm afraid it is pretty grim where we are, and I'm sure you guys are all quite well aware of that at the moment, and there's various reports that you can tap into to just look at the state of nature today. One of them, which was put together in 2019 and has looked at 8,500 species that had sufficient data available from the IUCN regional red list criteria, is the State of Nature Report 2019. And it says that 15% of UK species are threatened with extinction and 2% of species have already gone extinct. And looking at the turtle dove, which we have in this picture here, that's actually seen a 98% decline. So an actual huge number. One thing I want to sort of point out with these figures is they go from a baseline of about 1960s. So 1960s upwards, in fact. So it's also really important to think about where we are with our extinction rates and look at what we're comparing it to. And you might have heard of something called the shifting baseline syndrome, where we all remember the abundance of wildlife and what wildlife was like when we were young. And I remember, you know, harassing newts and sticklebacks in my local stream. And really that's what my vision perhaps of what abundant nature should be. But actually, when you go back to my parents when they were young, my grandparents and so on, you would have seen a very different picture. So really, we've got to be careful about this. Are we just already lost 2% of species, or is it a lot greater than that? And I think, you know, we really should see these as minimum numbers. The Biodiversity Intactness Index is another one that also looks at kind of the abundance of wildlife compared to pre-modern times. And we're actually ranked 189th, which I think you can all agree probably isn't the best position to be in. So, you know, the UK is in a bit of a dire state, and effectively we do need to really act fast and look at nature recovery as a kind of, you know, we need to make an immediate response to it. So one of the things to think about, and I think we all need to look at in our own environment, be it where you work, where you do your walks, even where you holiday, you know, think about what our landscapes were created for. So we often talk about Britain as this sort of green and pleasant land, but a lot of this view of nature has come from kind of collecting it, getting power of, exterminating, so getting rid of certain species just because they bother us basically, but also cultivating, controlling and tidying. So, you know, we're quite often seeing straight lines and very tidied up nature. Everybody wants to sweep their leaves and mow their lawn, and effectively it's almost like saying, you know, I'm not quite comfortable with having this messy nature around us. So what were people's needs in the past? You know, we had the agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, we were feeding a nation after war. None of those things are happening at the moment. And there's a very, very different societal need today. We're facing, you know, we've got pandemic, we've got climate change, we've got, you know, increasing mental health and other illnesses as well, things like diabetes and, you know, obesity issues. So people aren't getting outside enough and they're not embracing local nature. So if it isn't straight lines and, you know, neat, tidy edges, what is it? And nature isn't tidy. It doesn't fit in boxes, all these straight lines. The very essence, I think, of a balanced natural environment is imbalance. So we often think of nature at the edges, and we like to call things like buffer zones along, you know, rivers, along the sides of fields. We like to think of hedgerows, which are absolutely fantastic, but are really just a refuge. They're a managed scrub line, if you think about it. And one of the places that I work, I've spoken about earlier, the Knit Rewilding Project, it's a 3,500 former arable dairy farm. And what they've done is just really allow natural processes to take over. They introduced some drivers, some large herbivores and omnivores, which I'll talk a bit more about later. But they've effectively just let nature be itself and do its own thing within this large estate. And what you're seeing is this beautiful kind of what we call a kaleidoscope of different vegetation structures, lots of microhabitats, and lots of species that are thriving there. And if anyone's read Wilding by Isabella Tree, I do really recommend reading that, just to follow the story of that return from farming to nature. So with the species that we're seeing at NEP, it's just incredible. So it's the rare species. So the turtle dove, which we saw, that is one of the best turtle dove territories in the UK. Nightingales, also another rare bird. Purple emperor butterflies, they're all thriving there. So our bird ringer, who does bird ringing across Sussex, he actually did some bird ringing, I think it was last autumn or the autumn before, and he rang more black-capped birds and lesser white-throats in just over 2 weeks at NEP than he has done in this whole 30 years of bird ringing. And that's the word I like to call that is bioabundance. So we're not just thinking about these rare species and the headline kind of birds and butterflies and other species that are doing well. We're also thinking of this just abundance of common things, which is really, really important. So what are one of the principles? You know, we can't all have a NEP everywhere, as much as we'd love that, but you know, we do need to think about our land uses, and there are definitely some really key land uses that we have. What a report that was put together 2010 was done by Professor Sir John Lawton and was called Making Space for Nature. And it's actually one of those rare documents that actually really had a good policy impact. And it actually shaped both the natural environment white paper, but also the Biodiversity 2020 strategy. It's also now in the government 25-year plan. And the principles of that are just more, bigger, better, and joined up. So when you look at a system like this, you might have a core area like a nature reserve, but you've also got these corridors connecting through to areas that you're restoring. You've got some stepping stones as well, and buffer zones. And that's really so that animals can, and so both fauna and flora, they can disperse through the landscape and they've got somewhere to go, so somewhere to move into. So all of you living in Sussex know it's a pretty wet county. We've actually got over 4,000 kilometres of rivers and streams in Sussex, and these are our lifebloods. These are our veins, our arteries of the county. Unfortunately, as I sort of alluded to earlier, we haven't taken very good care of our river systems throughout Sussex. So we've canalised, sort of straightened up and tidied so many rivers. We've created obstacles for fish passages like weirs and locks. We've put lots of pollutants in, and we've got lots of soil runoff. So effectively our rivers are in a pretty poor state. So the opportunity for these as one of those corridors to enhance and for nature to be able to connect it is really, really strong. If we can start off at least with our rivers and work as best we can to improve and enhance them, and that's a really, really good start. So as Dinah spoke about earlier, the idea of this 30% by 2030 is a kind of strategy that is being put forward just by the government, but also by lots of different organisations such as the Wildlife Trust. And we actually want to go a step further as well. So we want to see 50% by 2050. And we can save the discussion for whether it should be East or West Sussex. I'm open to ideas on that. But seriously, we're looking at throughout the county. We need to really make what we call a nature recovery network. And you'll probably start to hear this so much more about these networks of nature recovery. And what that basically is alluding to those Lawton principles we spoke about earlier. So connecting up all of these habitats really throughout Sussex. So what my job is as the Wild Landscape Advisor is talking to lots of different landowners. So across the county, I'll have different landowners will come and we will give advice on, and it could be, 10 acres through to 1,000 acres and everywhere in between. But we also do some projects as well that we're really focusing on. And by that, we'll have project officers that are looking after these projects and working with local landowners. So one of these is the Wilder Horsham district, which is just here in West Sussex, and it actually has Knepp right in the middle of it. And this is a project with Wilder Horsham, it's called Wilder Horsham District, and it's a project run with Horsham District Council and Sussex Wildlife Trust. So we manage 2 project officers, which is a landowner advisor and a community outreach officer as well. And we're basically really focusing on Sussex. You've got a couple of river catchments throughout there, and you're looking at where this connectivity can happen. So the council has completely funded that. It's a 5-year project. And it's something we're really encouraging other councils to take on as well. And that's one thing that everybody can do, is talk to their local MPs, other councillors, and really encourage the councils from a sort of top-down approach, but working with local communities to try and really create these networks. Another one which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute is our Sussex Flow Initiative, and that's actually on the River Ouse. So we're looking at as a whole catchment, and we're looking at natural flood management, which I'll come to in just a moment. So we're not just running those couple of projects. We've also have, actually it was on the previous slide, the kelp project. We're working on our coast as well. And, we work both on terrestrial and marine environments. We've got a really active marine department as well in Sussex Wildlife Trust. But we've also got a couple of other projects that we work really closely with throughout Sussex. So one of them here, this yellow sort of block around right in the centre there, is called the Lost Woods of the Low Weald and the Downs. And that effectively is looking at the quality of small woods. So some of these woods that get a little bit ignored with subsidies or with management advice. And it's really looking at how we can enhance those woods. And one of the unusual things about this project, it's a project with Woodland Trust and the Small Woods Association and Sussex Wildlife Trust, is we're actually looking at wilder natural regeneration responses to these woodlands. So one of the words that I'm not a massive fan of is managed, because it really suggests that us humans are in control. And that's one thing we're really trying to step away with. So this project is looking about how these woods can be better left to do their own thing. But of course, they've had a lot of modification. So some of them might have a lot of plantation type woodland on, or there's lots of rhododendron, things like that. So we're effectively working to maybe do some intervention to begin with, but to really let these woods naturally regenerate over time. So I spoke of earlier, I mentioned the Sussex Flow Initiative, and effectively this is our work in the River Ouse catchment, which is a really beautiful catchment in the heart of Sussex, and you guys will know well, it runs through Lewes. So we're working across the catchment, mainly up in the headwaters, so in the sort of in the top part of the catchment, and that's to slow the flow of water down. So there's a few reasons we do that, and probably the obvious one is to really reduce flooding, and that's something that we have to really take quite seriously. We know with climate change we're going to see more extreme weather, but also things like drought as well. At the moment, with our canalised sort of straightened rivers, which I spoke about earlier, water will just run off into those rivers and straight out to sea. There's not enough character in those rivers, so things like woody debris dams that would have naturally formed with storm flow and also other natural disturbance. We're effectively acting a bit like beavers in this case. So this is a natural process that's missing from our waters in Sussex and pretty much over the UK, although there are a few populations out there, and that's something I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. But effectively what we want to do is mimic that process at the moment. So you can see these woody debris dams that we put in, and what that just does is stop all that sediment flowing out really quickly, all that pollution. It actually can keep it off so it's not running through the river. And effectively it's creating life for lots of different things there. So lots of, whether it's invertebrates or the vegetation and other species, it just basically is helping slow that flow of water, stopping that flooding in peak flow, and just creating that heterogeneity within those rivers. So we work across the catchment. We meet up with landowners and we will give them advice on how they can do that. And sometimes we actually go in directly. So we directly have put these interventions in about 500 hectares of woodland just this last year. And we've given advice to about 700 hectares of land in this area, and not just on these woody debris dams, it's looking at the whole picture as well. So we might advise on some tree planting, particularly for species like black poplar or something like that, where it's really rare in Sussex, but we might also advise on natural regeneration and how to help trees get away, which is what I talked about earlier as well, that sort of allowing scrubby, messy nature to take over. So the project's been going since 2012. And it's supported, so we work with the Woodland Trust for it and the Environment Agency, so it's funded by them, but we also get a great lot of support by the Lewes District Council as well. And we really hope to work on this as a sort of wider catchment over the next few years. So instead of us humans putting in these woody debris dams, the best thing you could do is just bring in beavers. And really, I think we can mimic nature to a point, but effectively the best ones for it are just bringing in these natural ecosystem engineers. So beavers at the moment are seeing a bit of a comeback. It is frustratingly slow. You probably may have heard of some of the free living beavers that we have. The probably most well-known ones are the River Otter down in Devon and also up in Tay, on the River Tay up in Scotland. There's a number of beavers elsewhere, but these are really sort of well-known catchments. But they're also being reintroduced to lots of different enclosures over basically the UK. And you've probably heard of recently the beavers that we reintroduced at NEP as one of the projects in Sussex to try and get beavers back in our waterways. That was quite a challenging one, and I'm really happy to talk about that probably more in the questions. It does show, because we had a couple of escapes from that project, and really unfortunately one of the beavers died from septicemia. It shows the challenges of keeping these beavers in enclosures. When you look at some of the successes of projects like on the River Otter, really to sort of beg the question, do we really need to keep them enclosed, or can we actually just let beavers back in our water? And why should we do that? Well, I talked about earlier these woody debris dams, but there's so much more that they will do. They engineer the water in so many ways that we just cannot mimic exactly. We don't have their amazing skill for this. They will respond to this flow of water. So they will try and slow that water down. And what that does is create stable banks, which is great for vegetation that they're going to eat. So it really helps that vegetation pulse and that growth around the river. It creates meanders and getting back so much more sort of morphology to the river, so that it becomes so much more interesting than the straight canalized rivers with no character at all that we've put in. And they also just breathe life into them. So all other species, freshwater invertebrates, dragonflies, amphibians, reptiles, birds, so many things benefit from having beavers there. And that, of course, when you start to look at the predator level and you look at other species that benefit from a lot smaller abundant species, it just really brings that circle back where you have full predators in as well. So beavers are one of the ways to create sort of natural disturbance and to have natural processes back in Sussex. But the other thing that we've seen through NEP and other work that I do with large herbivores is the more if you look back at what our actual fauna and flora would have evolved with, we would have evolved with bison, and there were giant beavers, there were full gilder predators, we had the aurochs, which is the wild cattle, tarpan, the wild horse, we would have had straight-tusked elephants, and you can look back through the Quaternary period and really see the species that would have impacted our environment. So a way to sort of the restoration of land is actually to see what niches are missing and what is missing from the environment, and what can we put back in to start these back up again. So at the Net Rewilding Project, we have Exmoor ponies acting as a proxy for the tarpan, the European wild horse. We have longhorn cattle acting as a proxy for the aurochs. There are Tamworth pigs, which are acting as a proxy for the wild boar. And all of them are creating lots and lots of disturbance in various ways. They're putting nutrients back into the system. They're dispersing seeds through as well, so they're helping with vegetation. The areas that they're leaving, whether it's bare soil or they're rooting up, is allowing new plants to colonize, and we're seeing the results of that of some of those species I spoke about earlier, like the turtle dove and the nightingale, purple emperor butterfly, that are just doing so well from having all this disturbance. So the other side of it is kind of looking at the full circle of life, and I spoke a bit about predators earlier, but we are missing predators from the ecosystem. At NEP, what we have to do is back to mimicking. So just like the woody debris dams that we're mimicking larger predators like the wolf by actually taking some of these species off for meat. And like I say, we can do our best to do this, but we're not ever do it as perfectly as that natural species would. But in Sussex, for now, that is probably the best way we can go about this mimicking process. What happens with these species? You know, they're having self-selection, they're creating all this vegetation disturbance, the different heterogenic vegetation in the environment. So lots of these really scrubby edges, and you've got some rough patches of lawn and thorny scrub, deadwood and things like that. And that is really just created by having this full guild of herbivores in there. They would do things like self-medicate. So they'd be eating things like willow, which is where we get our aspirin from. And they're able to self-medicate from that, and that reduces our burden on things like wormers and other medications, which actually makes the ecosystem much healthier. So going back to initially when I was talking about these pollutants and things that we put into the ecosystem, by allowing these natural processes to come in, what we really see is a more resilient ecosystem that doesn't need all these extra fertilizers and pesticides and medications, and it just makes everything so much healthier. So finally, really, I just want to leave it with to say that Sussex is a really exciting area for nature recovery. And we don't often think that because we think how busy it is in the southeast of England. But when you think of where we're set on a global level, you know, temperate environment, we've got a warm temperature, we've got lots of migratory species moving through. We know that species are going to move northwards with climate change. We've got a really good level of woodland already. So that gives our opportunity for natural regeneration a really great start. And also we've got enough to not have to worry so much about the types of species which you might have in other areas of the country. So the possibility for natural regeneration is really, really high. If you add to that the reintroductions, so looking at the beaver reintroductions, and one thing I should have mentioned is actually not just with the net beavers, we're actually doing habitat mapping across Sussex to see where beavers would best fit in. But I think more importantly, so we know that we can put these natural processes in, we know we can do some reintroductions, but I think we also have to give new value to what we think is beautiful. So we need to celebrate scrubby, messy nature. We want to move away from straight lines and manage vegetation. We also want to think about our language. So I spoke earlier of, you know, let's let go of the word conservation and move on to nature recovery or wildlife recovery. And let's think about human-wildlife contact and not conflict. So where are we going to increase our tolerance levels? You know, we all say, you know, and I think we're probably all participating in this event because we want a wilder nature, but does that mean we're willing to drive a bit slower on the roads and maybe have our dog on a lead for a bit longer on a walk? Are we, you know, going to allow maybe a bit of crop damage if we do have that, or allow some areas where animals can just really make a mess and let that nature restore? So it's quite a lot about your mindset and making sure that we can think about wild nature and just really, really embrace it. So thank you very much. This is all our various handles for you to follow, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram as well as Rena Quinlan. If you have any questions or have any land that you would like us to come and talk to you about reintroductions or restoration, you can first get in contact with Charlotte, who's our wild call officer, and she will help you out from anything from back garden through to large estates, and she'll be able to pass any basically people that are interested in making their land a wilder place through to me. So yeah, get in touch.
Fantastic, thank you, Rena. Wow, that covered lots of information. Fantastic. Yeah, thanks. I've got a few questions lined up, and then we've got about 10 minutes, so we'll see how we go. And then if anybody's got any more questions after that, do put them in the chat for us as well. So we're going to start with Becky and Roy, who have a question about volunteering with the project. Do you want to ask Rena?
Yeah, just wondering how we can volunteer for these different projects. How do we get on board?
Brilliant. So we do have volunteer sign-up forms on the Sussex Wildlife Trust website, and you can put in things like your interests in there as well and your location. So that really helps. With regards to the different projects, so Sussex Flow Initiative or the Lost Woods project, we have project pages, and we've got them either on Facebook or on the Sussex Wildlife Trust website, and they've got volunteer opportunities. At the the moment we've got a bit of a block on volunteering, as you can imagine. We're all stuck at home and not out getting as much done, but I think that just means we're going to be really, really busy come, you know, when we're able to. So we really, we appreciate any support in volunteering. The other thing I would say is just get involved with your local groups. So we, you know, it's quite easy for us sometimes to speak to the local community group and for them to tell us about the projects they'd like to do, and then we can support that. So that's another really great way. And I think, you know, also understanding from a local level, you all know your local councillors and local people that you should be talking to try and get some of these projects underway. So that also helps from that kind of local group perspective as well.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Hilary wanted to ask about beavers. Hilary.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, oh, what a wonderful talk, Rena. Thanks so much. I just feel so excited about it all. But I asked the devil's advocate question about beavers, and you know, rewilding. How much of a free rein could you possibly give them? Could we possibly give them? Because I know in Net they were. What was your name for? Manage but you know, say in if they're not contained, you know, how is it going to work with local farmers, local people? There has to be a balance, isn't it? I think that's the point I want to make. You know, just
and it is
freedom.
There is such a complex issue, and I think a lot of the worries about beavers are actually just misunderstanding of the species and how they will act. I mean, to give, you know, an idea of, we're looking at maximum sort of 20 to 50 meters from a water course that they would impact. So sometimes it might just be a case of saying, I'm just going to give a little bit more space to let them have that impact. And you know, and then we can all step away and we can just enjoy what they're doing and not worry about it and affecting. I think the way that subsidies are going, so we're just coming off the cap and we're going to move into environmental land management scheme called ELMS. Hopefully that will really provide a lot of benefits to landowners that are wanting to have beavers on their land, and that's something that we're trying to get updated as much as possible, and as these developments happen, so that we can be really well placed to advise landowners on the best thing to do. But certainly I think the idea that landowners should be rewarded more for having, you know, allowing these what we call natural capital as well, and ecosystem services, which, you know, whether or not you like those terms or not, if landowners actually put a service in for people by, you know, having clean water and slowing the flow of flooding and things like that, and beavers is one of those strategies, then they should get rewarded for it, and not necessarily for some of the rewards they've been given in the past. And I think also we're quite lucky that, you know, Europe's had so many beavers being either reintroduced or recolonized areas, and the mitigation strategies they have are just fantastic. So we've actually are in a place where all the hard work has been done for us, and actually places like Devon and Scotland as well, there's so many good examples of mitigation up there. So I think, you know, it's about learning from other people as well, getting the best practice for us, so that when beavers do return to Sussex, and they will 100%, you know, they will be here in the next few years, you know, absolutely, and whether they're in enclosures or released as natural. But yeah, we will definitely we'll see them here, and we will make sure that we're ready and we've got those mitigation sort of strategies in place, basically. So
great, thanks so much. 100% behind you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay. Charlie wanted to say something about Ouse Valley Cares.
Hello there. For a year, I've had this vision of the Ouse Estuary Nature Reserve being quadrupled in size, so that it covers the entire area from the Denton roundabout to the sea, and from the new port access road to the A259. So encompassing Tide Mills right the way up to Forth Hill. And that has now been expressed with support from Newhaven Town Council last week and Seaford Town Council last week, which is fantastic. It's a complicated vision to implement, and because it deals with local authorities and unifying the ownership, but the vision is wide, and it does involve rewilding agricultural land. Because the land, particularly north of the railway line in that area I've demarcated, is currently agricultural and needs to be rewilded. The vision, as I say, is that it will make that area fit not only for biodiversity, but also climate change mitigation, because you're talking about the upper Ouse, which is purely runoff. Where I'm talking about, it's when high tide hits peak flow. That's what causes Cliff getting flooded and New Haven town getting flooded, and we want the tide mills to be resurrected as a pond. So my point about saying all that is, first of all, to alert people. SEA know about it, SWT know about it, Cycle Sea Haven. We're working with 14 voluntary organisations at the moment through Seaford Community Partnership, but we need to develop that. So what I would say is, if anyone is interested in following this up, get in touch with SEA, get in touch with Seaford Community Partnership, because this is where you will find out more, which is important, and secondly, catch the vision, and therefore help with this project. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. That sounds amazing.
All right, we're going to have to move on now. I want to say thank you on behalf of everybody to Rena for that fantastic talk, and we need to move on to our next speaker now. There might be time at the end to come back if we have any spare time at the end. Joe, I need to move. Have you got something really quick?
Just could we put the email address that was spoken about for contacting for the Wildlife Fund, Wildlife Trust email, if anyone's got any questions or wants some help with things? Can we put that up in the chat, please? Thanks.
Okay, good idea. Thank you. All right, so our next speaker, who's going to talk for about 20 minutes as well, is Dylan Walker, who is an ecologist and a rewilding consultant. So over to Dylan.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Can you see my screen okay? Let me just make it a bit larger for you here. If you can. How's that looking? All good?
Yeah.
Thumbs up, perfect. Well, thanks for inviting me to the Lewis Climate Hub Forum. It's really exciting to be here, and really interesting talk from Rena. It's fascinating to hear her take on the rewilding process, and hopefully some of the things that I'll talk about will kind of chime in with that. I'm a consultant, I'm an ecologist. The thing I'm really interested in is how people can engage with the rewilding process, and how can we get communities in particular kind of pull together and this really exciting initiative that's clearly kind of grabbing lots of people's attention, and for good reason. So in my talk, I wanted to kind of cover a number of themes, just touch on what is rewilding from my perspective, why is it important, what are the role of people and communities in rewilding, and just some simple ideas about how we could rewild, how all of us could actually be involved in the rewilding process, no matter how small the area of land we have available to us, window box upwards. So let's go through and talk about some of those things. So there are lots of different definitions of rewilding actually when you search around the internet. So not to be outdone, I thought I'd invent my own. So this is one sort of simple version of it that I hope kind of encapsulates it for you. So rewilding is a form of nature conservation that recognizes that wildlife can look after itself if we restore the native species that used to roam our countryside. So I think what we're starting to realize is just how important those lost native species were. And the question is, well, why were they so important? What difference did they really make? And as Rena's touched on her talk, it's really the fact that these animals were engineers. And that is a word that we are all very familiar with, of course, because there are few better engineers than human beings. We've engineered entire cities and cityscapes, building them from the ground to incredible heights. So we understand about engineering, but what we're increasingly understanding is the engineering capabilities of some of the animals that used to and still live around us. And so let's have a look at a couple of obvious examples of those. So here's one we've touched on already. Beavers create these incredible dams, these structures, which are not just good for them, but they're actually engineering the landscape. They are reducing the risk of flooding, but also creating these incredible wetland areas, these ponds and lakes and wetland habitats that are just so important for so many other animals, for fishes, for invertebrates, for amphibians, for birds. So they're creating habitats themselves. They are ecosystem engineers. Let's take a look at another one that we don't have in the UK right now, but we did once, the wolf. We know from studies of Yellowstone National Park, which I would thoroughly recommend you look at if you haven't already, that wolves re-engineered the ecosystem when they were reintroduced. They actually allowed saplings and trees to regenerate along river systems. Why? Because deer, who were overpopulating the area, felt more nervous in those areas. They felt the wolves could attack them. They were vulnerable in those spots. So when the wolves returned, the deer population reduced in those areas and allowed it to regenerate, created new habitat. So wolves are ecosystem engineers. And as previously discussed, we have these large herbivores that used to roam across the British Isles in far larger numbers and diversity than they do today. And of course, they browse and graze the landscape, they reduce tree cover, they create open spaces and mosaics, and they are engineering the environment and the landscape around them. So they're creating these niches and these habitats for lots of other plants and animals and fungi to proliferate and enjoy. And we've lost so many of these. I would really recommend that you have a look at Rewilding Europe's wonderful illustrations, which you can find online. I've just put a bit of a montage of these together here. They're absolutely fantastic. You can see here the beaver, the bison, the wolf, and the wild horse. And what's lovely about them is they show the impact of these ecosystem engineers, how they bring other animals into play and provide niches, feeding and breeding niches for all of these other animals just by existing in the landscape. And that's something that wildlife conservationists are really coming around to understanding, the real benefits of these animals, many of which we've lost. But I do have one slight issue with these fantastic illustrations. There's one species, there's one animal that I don't see in any of these illustrations, and I find that a little bit frustrating. And that species is, of course, us, human beings. Where do we fit with this whole concept of rewilding? How integral should we be to it? Are we to be on the inside at the very center of it? Should we be on the outside looking in and gazing in at these incredible wild parks? What is the future? And I have a very firm belief that human beings, modern human beings, the populations that we have now, we have to be at the center of this process. We absolutely need to be engaging with and back on our landscape. And that means we need to understand rewilding and be part of it. What's the evidence for that? Well, one thing we do know is that human beings have been roaming the British landscape for almost 1 million years. That is a long time to be integrating into the ecosystem. Yes, we've been thrown off a few times, a few glaciations have occurred and we found it a bit cold, and along with most of the other mammals, we've been chucked out, but we came back. And we've been very much integral to that landscape. In fact, there were several species of humans roaming the landscape. That's something to contemplate. And the latest modern humans, look at your partner or look at someone else in the room at this moment, appeared in the British Isles around about 40,000 years ago. So very, very recently. If you think about that, almost 1 million years of inhabitancy of these islands from human beings. And I would wager that when we arrived, we probably actually enhanced the landscape. I think there's a very good chance that we increased biodiversity. We were just one other animal that integrated and changed and evolved and moved the landscape around. And like other top predators, we would have been hunting and fishing and moved animals through that hunting dance that takes place between predators and herbivores. We also would have been foraging for fruit and nuts and redistributing seeds across the landscape and adding to the ecosystem in that way. we would have been lighting fires most probably, which also is good for things like dead wood and certain fungi that thrive on these kind of ashes from fires. So all these things add diversity to the landscape. But somewhere along the way, something started to go wrong. We maybe got a bit greedy. We started over hunting certain species. And we know from the historical record, the archaeological record and beyond, that we started to lose some of these species. But it's not that long ago. I mean, we had straight-tusked elephants in the British Isles until 120,000 years ago. Woolly mammoths just 11,000 years ago when we lost them. An Irish elk with its huge antlers we lost from the British Isles just 8,000 years ago. Really not long in terms of ecosystems. And then just 7,000 years ago, a whole new wave of human beings came across to the British Isles, and they brought with them agriculture. I mean, 1 million years of human beings, just 7,000 years of agriculture. It's tiny, isn't it? But now we have a whole different reason for being. Now we have something to protect. Our desire now is to keep certain animals and plants out of our environment and to protect our crops and protect our animals. And as a result of that, we see further extinctions. The auroch, the wild cattle, extinct 3,500 years ago. Lynx, 1,550 years ago. Brown bear, 1,200 years ago. There are oak trees alive today that probably had a brown bear scratching itself underneath them. Imagine that. Wild boar just 450 years ago, and wolf 260 years ago. So these were major predators and herbivores that were roaming our landscape and having a massive impact on our ecosystems. And slowly but surely, they have declined. But I would also argue that there is another species that, whilst you certainly couldn't say it's extinct, I would argue that it's come close to extinction across the British landscape. And guess who it is? It's back to us. It's the human beings again. You know, something terrible happened 270 years ago. It was called the Enclosures Act, a series of acts that lasted over 100 years. And those acts meant that the common person who owned small amounts of land across the United Kingdom and Ireland were thrown off those pieces of land, and larger farms and landowners owned more land, but there were fewer of us that actually owned land. And we still suffer the consequences of that today. I mean, this is an absolutely shocking statistic. Half of the entirety of England is owned by 1% of its population. The other half, there are 55 million of us squeezed into it. So to put it another way, roughly the population of Haywards Heath owns half of England. Not literally, I don't want you to worry too much about the people of Haywards Heath, good people, there they are. But it's incredible how we've also found ourselves not able to roam the land that we used to be able to roam, just like many of these animals that have become extinct. And that is a real problem in terms of our opportunities to connect with nature. So I thought I would have a go at sort of re-envisioning the concept of rewilding from a community perspective, from a perspective of how people engage with nature. Because I think that this rewilding revolution, if you like, is so exciting. But alongside it, we really need to think much more carefully about our place within this rewilding. Because if we're going to save the planet, we need to think about how we're going to rewild ourselves and how we're going to get communities and people engaged with nature through rewilding. This cannot just be something for those people that own large pieces of land. So this is my attempt anyway. So community rewilding is a form of nature conservation that empowers communities to actively participate as engineers of rich, biodiverse ecosystems. If other animals can be the engineers, surely we can as well. Rewilding communities restore native species and replicate natural processes for social, economic, and environmental benefit. And they break down barriers associated with exclusive land ownership, focusing instead on land sharing, land access, and land stewardship. So that's a bit of my take on where we need to go, how we need to combine our increased access with the land, with engaging personally with the rewilding process. But what about now? What about our homes and our gardens and our rooftops and our windowsills? What can we do with the little pieces of land that most of us have available to us? Well, it's a good place to start. And I guess the first obvious thing is to say is to let nature into your land if you can. There are other simple things to do. Letting your lawn go for a few weeks in the summer unmown is a wonderful way of seeing flowers come up, and bees feeding on the nectar. Planting a tree if you have space, or a hedge. Digging a pond, my personal favourite, digging a pond, even in the smallest of urban spaces, allows wildlife to proliferate. And I think all that stuff is a really important first step that we should all make. What I would say, though, is that for me, that is not rewilding. That is wildlife gardening, which is great. But I think we can go further. I think that's what's so exciting about rewilding, is that even in small spaces, how can we actually replicate these processes? Admittedly, can't put an enormous great red deer stag in the back of your average person's garden, although if we start to rewild it, maybe we'll find one there one morning, which is even more exciting. But what can we do? Well, let's have a look at some of those opportunities to replicate these wild processes. We know that one thing that beavers do is to coppice trees, something that people have done through the generations. And British trees, many species, actually respond incredibly well to coppicing because they're so used to it happening to them. They have to evolve and adapt to it. And when they regenerate, it creates loads of new young shoots coming through. It's fantastic for insects, great for nesting birds. So coppicing is actually replicating a beaver or another, or an elephant, a long-tusked elephant. They also used to rip trees apart, just like they do in Africa today. What else can we do more of? Pruning. I mean, herbivores browsing. What's the difference between that and human beings pruning their fruit trees, for example? Why do we do it? We do it for a good reason. It regenerates the tree. It creates more flowers, creates more fruit. That's great for wildlife. We're replicating those natural processes. What about this one? Coming up for February, I think it's National Nest Box Days coming up, or it's maybe even this weekend. We could make normal nest boxes like we have for generations, or we could build our very own white stork nest, which you can see on the right-hand side here. Fantastic that white storks are coming back to the UK. It's going to take a long time before they're everywhere, so why don't we give them a helping hand? If you go to my website, I can show you how to do this. It's super simple. But why would you? Well, these are ecosystems in their own right. They can be up to a ton in weight. They make fantastic refuges for overwintering butterflies and insects. They are very, very important nest sites, not just for storks, but for house sparrows and tree sparrows, which have declined catastrophically across the UK. So there are other ways that we can replicate our wilder inhabitants and still create these amazing habitats in our own homes and gardens. Here's a really controversial one for you. So everyone's seen their cats scratching to sharpen their claws. Well, bears, particularly in springtime, we used to have brown bears in this country, they typically will scratch younger trees, damage them, because they're trying to get to the cambium beneath, which is sweet in the springtime. That's nutritious, so they'll scratch the trees and they'll have a bit of a chew and a bit of a gnaw in there, and that damages those trees. But actually, it's creating a niche. It's creating a niche for deadwood saprophytic beetles and invertebrates. As these trees get older, that weakness actually forms holes, which are important for nesting, for roosting bats and for birds. So you could use, for example, a hand rake is very, very similar to a bear's claws, and do a little bit of tree damage and replicate what our ecosystems used to be like when we had brown bears. Now, it's very controversial and you might want to do that. The point I'm trying to make is we could have a lot of fun in small spaces thinking about how these animals used to behave. And I'd love to hear your own ideas. This is just about being creative. And the more creative we are, and the more kind of diversity we create in our own environments, the better it is for our wildlife. It's really as simple as that. We talked earlier about grazers. This is where it gets really fun. You're going to have to knock on your neighbour's door now, because I mean, if you've only got a back lawn, you can't put a horse or a deer on it. But what about if you borrowed the neighbour's chickens, got a few rabbits in every so often, see if you could borrow a guinea pig from your niece? I mean, what would happen? All of these animals graze at different levels. They choose different plants, just like those big herbivores. Maybe even at small sites, we could actually increase biodiversity and have a lot of fun doing it. And I think it's easy with our homes and our gardens to think we can't have a big impact, but of course we really can. There are 10 million acres of gardens across Britain. That is absolutely huge. In fact, there's more acreage of gardens in our country than there is all of the nature reserves put together. So yes, we can do small things in our little environment and make a big difference. But to do so, we need a helping hand, and especially if we are to come together as communities, as individuals. The number one question I get from people is, I want to do rewilding. How can I do it? Who can I connect with? And here I'd really like to point you towards the Rewilding Britain charity and the website that they run, which is excellent. They've got some very exciting initiatives coming up, and one of the biggest ones is the Rewilding Network. And a big part of that will be providing opportunities for individuals in communities to connect with each other through an online forum. The Rewilding Britain team are going to start providing supporting information and advice to be able to support that process. So there are already communities around the UK who are gathering together to start community rewilding projects, but it's in its infancy. But I really think the Rewilding Network is going to help to sort of accelerate that process. And hopefully those of us who want to do this stuff can connect and really get the ball rolling. And I think it's also really important to look at kind of some of the initiatives that are out there already. This is a wonderful one, in my opinion. This is Street Goat, which is a community initiative running in Bristol, where they're moving their ownership of goats, and they're moving those goats around different urban landscapes, regenerating the vegetation, providing food for local people as well through milk and cheese from the goats, and just what a wonderful thing to be able to walk through an urban environment and see semi-wild goats as part of your landscape. And through community rewilding, I think we can do more of these things. We can be sharing animals, we can be working together, and I think we can play a really major role in this process. But I think one of the biggest challenges is over land. I think we found that in our discussions in Lewis, for example, over the last 12 months. But we've got to face it head on as a community, and we've got to look at all of the land that we have available collectively. And we need to look at common land, which is something that we still do have access and ownership of as the people of this country. We need to look at areas of wasteland. We need to look at council-owned land. Some of this land the council can barely afford to manage themselves anymore and may welcome the help. We need to engage more with private landowners and work with them and encourage them to not only think about rewilding, but think about how communities can be a bigger part of land management. And then we need to look at land purchase, and I think there'll be more money available for land purchase, but we're the community. We can also crowdfund and get more land back into our common ownership so that we can do some really exciting things with it for people and for nature. And I'd like to finish off just by saying that this is just such a wonderful time. I mean, it's a scary time in terms of the climate crisis and the loss of biodiversity, but when our back's against the walls, that's when the really exciting stuff happens. And to think that there are already these incredible rewilding initiatives happening. We have a bison rewilding project in Kent that's begun. We have obviously beavers rewilding all over the country now. The net project with white storks is really exciting. We've got white-tailed seagulls returning to the Isle of Wight project there. There are so many great projects taking place, but it's essential, I think, that we think a lot more about how people can be at the very, very heart of this rewilding initiative. And with you guys on board and many others, that's the future. So thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Do have a look at my website, wildlife.org, and you can find me on Twitter as well, rewilding_gardener, and I'll happily take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. Fantastic. Okay, so we've got a few questions lined up already. First of all, Dinah, you wanted to ask about small mixed farms.
Yeah, hello, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, taking into account that all these creatures kind of co-create the environment and co-engineer it, the role of small mixed farms, which seem to be what indigenous farmers all over the world have traditionally had manage to live quite happily most of the time with the local fauna. Is that something that would be beneficial in our landscape in the UK?
Yeah, I think it does. You know, anything, you know, the rotation systems and really, I think what we see from Indigenous communities, which is so smart, is these communities are working so closely with nature, and they have such a profound understanding of nature that they're working within the framework of how nature works, really. So they might create, you know, an open space, chop down some rainforest, for example, but then that space is allowed to regenerate. And we can see with the mosaics of habitat that we've talked about with these other herbivores, that that's very much in sync with the way that the environment should be working. So I think any kind of system that allows us to maintain that variability, that diversity really, and that variability is taking us back closer to something that works for nature. You know, it is really important to bear in mind, I think, that whilst you know, we've lost so many of these species over the last, you know, hundreds or thousands of years, but we did retain a lot of our nature over that time, and that's because people were effectively replicating those ecosystems. You know, we were farming at a much smaller scale, we were coppicing and regenerating our woodland habitats, and so our nature was able to hold on and even thrive in those ecosystems. I think it's really, really important to note that the paper came out in 2019, which was looking at a huge number of big ecosystems, mostly tropical ecosystems, and it found that where there were indigenous communities, the biodiversity was actually higher than where there were no people and there were natural parks. So what we can see from that, if you're happy with that interpretation in the science, is that where people work closely with nature, we can actually achieve a higher level of biodiversity than we can when people are on the outside looking in. And that's why we really, really need to have that interaction, and we need to play around with those opportunities.
Okay.
So yes, they can work.
Thanks, Dylan. Charlie, did you want to pose your question about rewilding ourselves?
Hi, yeah. So you mentioned rewilding ourselves. I don't know if you meant at an individual level or community level, but I'm my big thing is thinking of ways to rewild myself as an individual, my worldview really. But I just wondered what you meant by that, if you've got any ideas.
Yeah, and I think it's all of those things, and it's going to be different things for different people. But essentially, I think probably everyone on this call would acknowledge that we have lost our connection with nature in many, many different ways. When we go to the supermarket, for example, and we've got to get that back. We've got to get back to being local, and we've got to get back to understanding what nature is. There's some really interesting research in the US, which was done quite a long time ago, and it showed that those people who hunted for food, even just from a social perspective, had as good an understanding of ecosystems as conservationists. And that's because they had a really good understanding of what natural ecosystems were, because they were out there hunting in them. So I think that's what we've lost. And there are a million different ways of finding ways to reconnect with nature, but we've got to encourage people to get out there. And I think this rewilding is a fabulous, fabulous kind of hook that we can use to get people back in our wild places again and actively involved.
I think that's so interesting, because you're actually implying a definition that is more about eco-literacy and understanding how things work, rather than just being in nature to connect. It's much more about learning how it works. And yeah, if you're a hunter or a fisherman, like my brother knows more about the river than I do because he fishes. That's such a good point. Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
No, I just to pick up on that, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. I don't think, there are many of us who don't spend time walking across the South Downs, but there's probably most of the people on this call do. But even that's probably not enough to really connect and understand how these ecosystems work. We've got to get our hands dirty again, and we've got to encourage our kids to really get stuck in there. But that's not a bad thing. It's exciting, it's fun. get in there and start experimenting. And I think that's what's great about rewilding, is none of us really know the true consequences of what happens when you either replicate these systems or you bring these animals onto the systems. That's what's so kind of firing everyone's imagination. But let's not have our imagination fired by watching it on television. Let's all get out there and actually do it.
Thank you. Brilliant. Very inspiring.
Okay, last question for this session, I think. Jo, you wanted to mention guerrilla gardening?
I did. Thank you so much, Dylan, for the talk. It was fantastic. Yeah, well, how do you feel about guerrilla gardening if it's done with wisdom? Because I think, you know, there's so much land being owned by landowners that maybe we need to be a little bit more stealth with things too.
Yeah, that's a tough question, isn't it? I think for me, it's more about how we give back to nature. You know, we touched on hunting, and I think foraging is another really great way of connecting and starting to understand our landscape more. So everyone goes out and picks blackberries, I hope, you know, but there is the country's full of all these amazing things that we can go out and eat. But the first thing people will worry about will be, oh, if we all do that, there's not going to be anything left. Well, not so if we do it in the right way. You know, if we forage for things but think, well, hang on, for everything I pick, I need to ensure that 2 new plants grow up in another location. How can I take a cutting? How can I make sure I replant some of these seeds and nuts? How can I be part of the ecosystem like these other animals? Then I think we can, so it's not quite answering a sort of guerrilla gardening question, but what I think we can start to do is, it could be more innate in the way that we think about our role in a landscape as giving back to wildlife. Rather than just going on a walk, why don't we go on a walk where we plant 3 oak acorns? You know, what harm can that possibly do? Worst thing is I'll feed a wood mouse or something. So maybe we can think more about how we do engage the landscape in a way that isn't going to offend anybody who owns land.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Fantastic. We're going to move on now to our last speaker, who is Helen Mead, who is the Programme Manager at the Railwayland Wildlife Trust. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for inviting me today. Thanks for your talk, Dylan. I do always find your sort of imaginative and creative approaches to thinking about these things so refreshing. Dylan once gave us a presentation at the Railwayland about how we should think about dogs in the way wolves might have once behaved in the landscape, and it was just so refreshing to think about these things in a different light. I would also counter that by saying, please don't forage on nature reserves. We have a 0 foraging policy at the Railwayland. I think we do have to balance these things with the impact that people have on the landscape. So as many of you know, the Railwayland Wildlife Trust, we're based at the Linklater Pavilion in Lewes. Our sort of raison d'etre really is to bring nature to the heart of Lewes, and in so doing promote nature-based solutions to climate change. Amongst other things, in the last few years, we have been working in facilitating ways of boosting natural capital by bringing interested groups and stakeholders together, working collaboratively to develop projects and funding applications on a local level. And collaboration, I think, is absolutely key to developing these solutions, which is why this sort of thing is so good. And honestly, well done for keeping going through lockdown with these meetings, because I have flagged, I must admit, on that front. So today, I just really wanted to quite briefly talk specifically about some work that we have done recently, holding the Lewes Tree Summit, and trying to establish, or looking to establish, a tree and wildflower nursery in Lewes. So I'm just about to share my screen. There we go. So this was Lewes Tree Summit, which took place beginning of March last year. This was literally 2 weeks before we went into lockdown. So it was an excellent event. We had more than 100 people. We were absolutely crammed into the Linklater Pavilion. We had individuals, activists, small landowners, professional foresters. There were representatives of community groups, environmental charities, and also importantly statutory bodies, Lewis District Council, South Downs National Park Authority. And it was intending to bring people together and look at sort of positive actions that we could take to share knowledge, to share learning, and generate actions that we could take forward. Obviously, we then went into lockdown, and that did slightly take the wind out of our sails, but we're now looking to really reinvigorate that. So the main outcomes for the Tree Summit really were thinking about tree planting as part of a wilder landscape, and acknowledging the fact that tree planting isn't always the best approach, but the right trees in the right places obviously are hugely beneficial. Tree planting generally, I think, is an extremely good way of engaging people. And as Dylan pointed out, engagement is something that we really need to embrace and make the most of as a means of reaching people who aren't already engaged with this sort of activity. I think within the environmental movement generally, it's difficult to get beyond preaching to the converted. And tree planting seems to be something that is really effective in doing that. Another outcome of the day was recognising the great potential that exists in joining up biodiversity hotspots through hedgerows and through linear planting in the way that Rena was demonstrating in the map from the Lawson principles. Obviously, land ownership comes up again and again, and there is a need for a really sort of coordinated, facilitated, unified approach to landowners that is well planned and well supported, so that it's easy for people to take action and to sort of participate on them. So specific actions, has my slide changed? Yes, so specific actions that we wanted to take forward from the Tree Summit. And this is really where I'm asking for help today. One thing that was very popular was to hold an annual Tree Summit to share learning, generate approaches to boosting natural capital. And I would be very interested to know what people would like to see at another Tree Summit. You know, we have our own ideas, but I think particularly having gone through this hiatus of lockdown, it would be really good for people to sort of give us ideas of what they would find useful at a Tree Summit. The other main action that came out of the day was the desire to establish a tree and wildflower nursery. And there are so many benefits from doing this. Firstly, we would be growing things from locally harvested seed, which is obviously much more sort of resilient to local pests and things like that. We can respond to local demand, we can distribute locally, you know, it's a more resilient, simpler local system that we could develop. For example, Wildflower Lewis, I know that there are representatives of Wildflower Lewis here. They have a local need for wildflowers. If we're growing them ourselves, it's just a stronger, more resilient system. And again, this is a fantastic engagement tool to actually be growing things from seed, from learning how to harvest seed, growing things from seed, nurturing them, and then seeing them planted out. It's a brilliant way of engaging people. It's a brilliant way of people really seeing the change that they can make in their local area. So we are very, very keen to get this idea for a tree and wildflower nursery off the ground. When I say we, who I'm specifically talking about is us at the Railway Land Wildlife Trust, Lewis Urban Arboretum. I know that Audrey is here today, and they do fantastic work planting trees around Lewis Town, Wildflower Lewis, and various other sorts of local groups. So we're a proper bunch of people. We want to get together this tree nursery, but we're looking for some land. And so really, I'm sort of putting the word out and asking people to spread the word. We're looking for a sort of allotment-sized plot, roughly. It can't actually be an allotment because there are various bylaws that prevent that. And ideally, that is well connected in terms of being able to walk to it, or a good cycle route, or public transport. That would be our sort of ideal. So that is my sort of call to action today. We're looking for a small piece of land to start this nursery, and I think that would really give a big boost to people being able to take action locally on this issue. The next slide, I've just got some gratuitous pictures of our annual Tree Day celebration. Planting acorns at the tree celebration, it was so popular, I can't tell you. But then it did give rise to, well, what do we do when they grow up a bit more, when they're saplings, you know? And so that's where the next logical step of starting this nursery is. So please get in touch. Here are my contact details. If you either have an idea for where we could start a tree and wildflower nursery, or if you'd like to get involved with that, if there is something that you would particularly like to see at the next tree summit, if you would like to come to the next tree summit, please get involved. We are also involved in developing various other projects around rewilding locally. And we have volunteering opportunities similar to Sussex Wildlife Trust. They're in a bit of a slump at the moment, but we have seen through the pandemic a real surge in people wanting to get involved and get their hands dirty, you know. So I think this is it's a real opportunity to sort of move that on. Yeah, so that's it from me today. I did actually also want to say about the Ouse Valley Cares project, which Charlie Grimble alluded to. This is a project that it's a big partnership project that's being led by the South Downs National Park Authority. It's got multiple partners. We're a partner in it. So is Lewes District Council, Seaford Community Partnership, Sussex Community Development Association, Transition Town Lewes, Ovesco, which is the Community Energy Group, and Community Energy South. So you will probably be hearing more about this project. CARES, the Ouse Valley CARES, stands for Climate Action, Resilient Ecosystems and Sustainability. So this is now in a development year, and I think during the process of the development there will be all sorts of opportunities for people to get involved. So I would just like to sort of say, keep your ears to the ground about the Ouse Valley CARES project. So that's it from me.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Helen. So we just had a couple of suggestions as to possible context for plots. I think Tasha asked about the councils. Does anybody? I know Matt Bird's here, but I don't know if anybody else knows anything about the county council. Tasha, did you want to just voice your suggestions?
Yep, I think Matt's answered it already. But I was saying perhaps could the council donate a little plot of land for the nursery?
Yeah, we certainly have been in touch with the council, and I think if they could, they would. But yeah.
Could it be that we could, I don't know where we find this plot of land, but could it be a joint ownership thing, as Dylan Walker was talking about, you know, a crowdfunding? We could find a small piece of land to buy. Could it be a crowdfunding so it's community owned?
Yeah. That is a very popular, that's quite a popular suggestion, I think. It would take, you know, it would take quite a bit of background work, I think, to sort of work out the legalities of how something like that would work.
Yeah.
but it is something that has cropped up again and again. And I guess, you know, if there is sufficient interest, it is something that we could look at taking forward.
Yeah, I suppose in terms of gathering the money, that's a good thing. You know, if a lot of people give a small amount, so that's an appealing thing, isn't it? Not everyone wants to get dirty or give their time, but a lot of people would be interested and would like the sort of concept of group ownership and spreading the financial weight. But I agree, it's a very complicated thing that you need central people running and
yes, exactly. Whereas I think actually starting up something like a tree or wildflower nursery, the beauty of it is how simple it could be actually. You know, and it just seems so elusive that we can't find this just a small patch of land somewhere to start it, you know, on a sort of peppercorn leaf or something like that. Just I can't believe that it's not there somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps there's somebody with a big patch of garden who they could cordon off the end of their garden or land that they've got. Who is this mystical, wonderful donor?
Yeah. Well, if anyone knows them, put them in touch.
Charlie also had a suggestion about human and nature. Is that the name? I don't know if Charlie's still there. She might have disappeared. And also Joe A said about some funding.
I was just hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I was just reminded from the tree summit. It did come up. There is a government scheme. It's very much for a carbon guarantee scheme. The idea is you plant trees and they'll guarantee you an income. So
yeah,
it's just a particular avenue.
Yeah.
And I am thinking opposite the tennis club, there's a big triangle of land which I could investigate. I know that has been used as a community allotment before. It got vandalised, but there's quite a lot of land there which would be very suitable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if you could get in touch with me, Joe.
Yeah, I've got your email.
Yeah. And I've also seen what Susan Murray has said about St Anne's School.
Oh yeah.
Okay, and Matt, did you want to answer as well for the district council?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that has come up a bit, sort of, well, more recently, probably because of offsetting to some degree, because, you know, that's the kind of elephant in the room nobody wants to talk about in terms of carbon offsetting. So there's there's a few sort of dual purposes, but I think, as Helen said, I mean, one of the things is around finances. Council is really strapped for cash, as a lot of organizations are. So, you know, what we're doing at the moment is we are looking at trying to just sell off assets, potentially buildings, trying to capitalize. And we have allocated money to wilding and potentially buying land, and obviously, you know, there's a lot of competing pressures with renewables, for instance. So people are using land for renewables and for food. And one piece of work that we commissioned recently was land and agriculture study. So it is working with Plumpton College and other landowners to see if there is the potential to, you know, get things going more like agroforestry potentially, but certainly the nursery. And we went to Flimwell recently, where, you know, you might be aware there's some great use of sort of local timber in a sort of development there. And I think it's just finding, you know, looking at the sort of supply chain and looking at all angles that is going to probably sort of solve this, actually. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and just very quickly, the last thing, two people have mentioned growing trees or flowers in their gardens, and then sort of as a meanwhile measure, Helen.
Yes, and I mean, I think people are already doing that. I know from Wildflower Lewis and Lewis Urban Arboretum that they are already doing that, and that, you know, that's fantastic. I think some people have found that, you know, by the end of the sort of growing season, they're tiptoeing through, you know, sort of huge amounts of plants that they've grown. I just also think that there is a real strength in people coming together to do this in one place, and that through doing that, that's where ideas are generated, and connections are made, and people can share skills and share ideas. So I think, yeah, like you say, Jane, it's a meanwhile solution, but actually there's more than just more space involved in having a nursery. There are all sorts of opportunities for social enterprise, training, engaging people, work experience, people, young people, things like that. So.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So we're going to hand over to Dinah for to close for us.
Hello again. So that is the first part of our 2 talks on renaturing and rewilding. Thank you so much for being here.